Everett Ramsey, and hello, Pastor Ramsey.
Hello, Dave. This is actually, I think people should know that you are a doctorate level knowledgeable person. You're Dr. David Ewing, and I consider you a personal friend as well as a colleague in the theology of Christ and the Christian Israel message. And I'm looking forward to this message tonight because I was a pastor in a Christian church for many years, never heard of the Christian Israel message. And when I did, I thought it was crazy, but now I know it's the truth. And you really can't understand the Bible until you know this message and have the whole message of God before you. So I think it's the only theology that encompasses the whole purpose of God. If you ask somebody, what is the Bible about? The average Christian can't tell you what the message of the Bible is. But the message of the Bible is very clear. It is God who has brought into this world his people, I'll call Adamites. And through Adam, he came to, of course, to the flood and destroyed most of them at one time because of sin. But then he called Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob Israel, and Israel became his elect. And they are exclusively his elect for covenant relationship. And if you don't understand that part of the message, you lose the entire effect of the New Testament and the Old Testament. It started with Adam, and of course, you're going to deal with Mount Sinai, and that's an interesting and exciting story. And I'm looking forward to hearing you talk about that.
Yeah, that'll be my next video series. There's a number of things I think that people actually don't know about Mount Sinai. But this Israel word really kind of started there when Jacob's name was changed to Israel. And in my Bible, it says it means power with God. But each Bible has a slightly different rendition of that. What would you say that Israel means?
Well, Israel does mean power with God, but it means to rule with God.
Right.
Adam was to rule with God. He failed. And later, Jacob Israel became the elect. God made a covenant with Abraham that was unconditional, and you'll probably deal with that too. But that unconditional covenant with Israel and with Abraham's stock is still in vogue, and it's not the people who live in the Middle East today. It's the people who are Christians, who are the Anglo race. Your title of your website is very apropos. And people need to learn that this message is God's message to his people.
Right. Well, to me, that is the most important thing. And of course, I'll talk about from my angle, the fact that the Israel people believed in Yehovah, which was Christ. And that's, I think, is my main thing that pastors miss, is that that was the whole thing. Israel people had power with God because they believed in God, but the God that they were believing in was the same entity we call Christ in the New Testament. And then in the New Testament, Christ says that he's teaching them about himself from the Old Testament. And basically, Luke 24:44, that's the main thing. But that's actually repeated multiple times. So Christ is teaching all these prophecies from the Old Testament. That's basically what he taught in the New Testament.
Absolutely. And he said, if you can't believe Moses, you can't believe me.
That's
so
it.
If you can't believe Moses and the prophets, and so if you can't tie the two, the New and Old Testament together, that's the problem with modern day Christianity. Right. They want to throw out the Old Testament.
You can't teach one without the other because they both are intertwined. You have 300 quotes back to the Old Testament from the New Testament. Plus you have 3,000 cross references, which a lot of that could actually be quotes. I mean, most of the New Testament could actually just be quotes instead of the way it's written.
Yes. And one of the problems with modern day Christianity that doesn't believe in the Christian Israel message is they've robbed God of his sovereignty. They're telling us that God cannot make a choice as to who he wants to redeem or who he wants to love. And yet the Bible is very clear over and over, many, many times, that he made a choice, that he loves some and hates others, and that he doesn't love everybody. So the Christian Israel message brings the truth of scriptures to the sovereignty of God. And it deals with God's sovereignty in dealing with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob Israel in both the Old and the New Testament. And it's the only theology that deals with this subject of God's elect. and identifying who they really are.
Yeah, amen. Well, give us some examples if you're going to start, with Adam. Give us some examples of how we would prove up that message.
Well, the way we prove it up is that over and over, Moses wrote in his books, Genesis through the 5 books of the Bible, the Old Testament. He talks about God choosing Israel only, or that he had given them special place only. He didn't say that about everybody in the world. And I realize that there are a lot of people want to try to say that all races came from Adam, but it's not true. And Adam is a special person. He was created in chapter 2 of Genesis. It says that God breathed into him a spirit. And it wasn't just air to make him breathe in and out. He breathed the Spirit of God into him and a place for that Spirit. And God was going to dwell in him and rule through him. And when he sinned, that postponed things, and things got delayed. And eventually the Adamite people generated and degenerated to the point where the flood was given. And when that was over, he came back again and said Shem is going to be the line for the covenant. And out of that Shem line came Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And in the New Testament, every single book in the New Testament was written to Israelites. It was not written to everybody. It was written to Israelites. He said, I've come to redeem my own. I've come to redeem my people. I've come to redeem Israel. And so he didn't say I came to save everybody and love everybody, but those that were under the law. And that's one of the keys Paul talked about, is that he came to redeem them that were under the law. And the only people I know of that were ever under the law was Adam and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Israel. And I don't know any others that have been put under the law of God, at least not in the scriptures. So the redemption of the exclusivity of Israel being his redeemed people, I think, is important. And that's why our people today don't know who they are. They don't know that they're the descendants of Israel. They don't know that they are the descendants of God's people, God's elect. And he loves us. He's given us a new covenant. It's an unconditional covenant, just like Abraham had. And he's going to bless us and protect us and watch over us. Yes, we can sin. And yes, we can lose our blessings. But he can no longer sell us out into another country, into the wicked. He's taken that part of it out. And we are either going to be blessed, or the people that try to ruin us are going to be hurt. And that's the important message that God's people need to know. We live in terrible days. We're hearing all the news that's going on about all these people doing these terrible things, and our nation is in such trouble. And it's because God's people have not lived right and not raised their children right. But we have God's promise that he's going to make things right. So I have great faith in God and in his ability to make things right.
Well, let me elucidate a couple of things you just said. You know, in the New Testament, we have this idea of being born again, which some pastors say, which really means born from above. Right. But isn't that the whole idea of what you just talked about with Adam, is that he was given the Spirit? So it's this Spirit which Christ talks about after he leaves. He talks about the Spirit, and that born from above, or born again, as people try to say, is people who have that Spirit, born from the Spirit, which was the concept of Israel people having power with God, is that they're given that Spirit of God, right?
Amen.
Okay, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
The way to prove up the other things you just said about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is that all through the Bible, that context, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, is mentioned over and over and over again. And not just in the Old Testament 1,000 times, but when you go to the New Testament, not only are there a number of mentions of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, I've got a whole chart on that, but there's also a mention of other racial terms like kindred. We know kindred in Acts, and men of Israel, children of Israel. Well, I created a whole chart just to make it easy for people. let's just bump over there real quick and I'll show you my chart. I've been working on this thing for a long time. It's called topical cross references, but this is the chart I'm going to use to prove up the point that you're making right now. Is that all through the Bible we have all these terms which all cross-reference back and forth to each other, but all only relate to Israel people.
Right.
Now, the 12 tribes they're really kindred tribes, and I've made up my own little acronyms here. You just mentioned Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and there's my acronym. However, these are other terms like aforetime. The angle stone is used in some translations versus headstone. Okay. The anointed people. When you talk about the Ark of the Covenant, that only applies to Israel people.
Right.
When you talk about the assembly or congregation of Israel or congregation of the saints, that only applies to Israel.
Absolutely.
And that's translated as church in the New Testament.
Absolutely.
When you talk about the blessings and the curses, that only applies to Israel. It can't apply to other people. The book of life or lives only applies to Israel people. Children of God only applies to them. Of course, children of Israel, children of Jacob, children of Zion. When he chose people, if he chooses the chosen, made a contract with people, the cornerstone, the covenant, the elect, the election, figs, olives, grapes, vine, the vineyard. You see, all of these terms can only apply to Israel people, Old Testament and New Testament, although there's some really good ones about this one here. Look at this. Formed, foreknew, foreknow, foreknowledge, foreordained, foresaw, foretold, and foreseeing. All those terms are used throughout the Old Testament and New Testament, however, only in the context of the Israel people.
Yeah.
So you see, I've got this long list of terms, and all these terms all throughout the Old Testament and the New Testament only cross-reference back and forth to each other. And then I'm basically going through the whole Bible, and right now I couldn't tell you how many pages I've got, but probably about 40. And then I get up into the New Testament, and then I've broken them down by book, and I'm still working on this part here. But these are all important terms that only apply to basically to Christian Israel. And then I point out that there's other people of Israel who didn't accept Christ. That's my whole point.
Right. Well, yeah, you've done an outstanding job in that area, and I hope people will take the time to study your website and look at those notes. But it just confirms that God is working for His people. He's doing everything in history and in prophecy. Everything that's done is for His kingdom through His people, Israel. And the word Israel doesn't mean that little country in the Middle East today. That is not what we're talking about. We're talking about those multiplied tribes that became multiplied millions, as God promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their seed would become as the sand of the sea and would become as the stars of the sky. Well, there's nobody on the earth, there's no tribes anywhere that can claim that kind of popularity or population except the Israel people and the Israel tribes. And they are the people that populate what we now know mostly as the Christian nations. So the Christian Israel message is that conclusion that God is working through Christianity, through Christ, to redeem His Israel people, which are the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
You got somebody behind you, maybe a worker.
Yeah, he walked in. Yeah, he did.
All right. Yeah, so you might want to mention to him that we're on live. At any rate, yeah, so I just switched back over to your channel. I want to make a mention that if they go to YouTube, and actually you have a domain that just comes here. It's called God's Covenant People. Right. And if they type in godscovenantpeople.com, it will just come directly to your channel. And that's the easiest way, because these new channels all have a bunch of gibberish in them like that up there at the top. So it's better to remember that. And we are putting your videos up at least a couple a month, and we're just trying to fill in the blanks here with this one and others, so you can get at least one a week up here on your channel. But you've already got some really good ones here, and people can go back. And then why don't you tell them a little bit about the conference, because we've only got, of course, up to the 2019 God's Covenant People Conference, but you've got a 2020 conference coming up next year. So why don't you just mention that to them?
Yeah, well, I first of all, before I do mention that, and I will, it leads into that. Brother Jennings has a conference in Tulsa every year. It'll be the last weekend in September this year, and they've asked me to come and preach. So I hope people will plan to come to that. But the national conference we have every year in Branson, it's called the Homecoming Conference for God's Covenant People. And it's grown every year. We had 2018, 2019. And we're expecting many more next year. Everywhere we go, people are excited about being able to come. And the people who have already come have promised to come back. So I'm expecting that. This year we had the same speakers coming, I think, for the most part. We have Brother Dave Barley from America's Promise. He just recently had a stroke. He is doing better. Looks like he's going to get to go home here pretty soon. And we have Ron Poch out of Atlanta. We've had Brother Jennings out of Tulsa. We had myself. We had Brother Don Elmore out of Kentucky. We're also inviting a pastor from Shell City to be here with us next year, if possible. He doesn't know yet if he's going to be able to make it. They have feast days sometimes the same time we have our conference. But we're hoping that he'll get to come. Dr. Blanchard, who put together the boot camp study of the Bible, he's going to be back. And so we're looking for a great crowd and a great spirit. It's been a great time. We've had two groups that have worked with music. My brother and his wife work with music, and also we have the couple out of Tulsa. I never can remember the name when I need it. I should have written it down, but they'll be with us again next year to work with the music, and that's good. And Dr. Dave here has always been doing our videoing, and he puts it up on the web for us, and we appreciate it. God bless him for doing all this for the kingdom of God. But anyway, we hope that you'll remember it's the first weekend in April. It'll be the first weekend in April in 2020. And we mean by that, we start on a Friday night and we go all day Saturday evening, and a half a day Sunday. So you plan now to come. We get special rates on the rooms where we stay. We have a great place where we can meet. They've remodeled the entire facility that we use for the meetings, and it's going to be a little bit bigger and it's going to be a little bit nicer. So everything is looking to be great. And we have several people who are actually going to be doing some advertising and some promoting of this conference for us. And we're looking forward to that. And I think that'll help with the attendance. The attendance has always been 150 to 200, sometimes a little over that. So we're expecting at least 300 maybe this year. That's our prayer, and that's our goal anyway.
Well, why don't you tell people a little bit about the Saxon University, since you're going to connect that to the Bible boot camp.
Right.
Sounds like.
We need to train. Everybody says we need to train some young guys. You know, I'm getting old, and all of the guys that are in the pulpits, we're not young chickens anymore. And we do have young people who want to take on the ministry and preaching of this message, and we need to train them. And we can do that without this high expense that, you know, there's colleges here in Springfield, Missouri that are getting $650 a credit hour, which is ridiculous. We don't charge anything for a credit hour. We do charge a little bit for registration. We do charge a little bit for the materials, whatever it costs us. We're not trying to make money on the university. We're trying to get the knowledge out. We already have about 50 people who have written for information. We're expecting some of them to enroll, and they will start with the boot camp studies. Then my book is going to be one of the studies. I think it's one of the most complete studies that they can have on the subject of Israel as the elect of God and God's plan and program. Probably some of your material will make it into the university at some point. I think you have some good material. And most of the speakers have some subjects that are great and that need to be used. And they need to be taught how to preach and what the responsibilities of a pastor is, and those kind of things. And that's what we want to do. We want to try to take young men and teach them the truth, and then give them the tools to go out and to build congregations with the study. And it can be done. I've done it.
Well, I agree with you. Otherwise, people go to church and they know about the Christian people in the New Testament. They just don't connect that knowledge back to the Israel people. Absolutely. That go all the way back to the Abrahamic covenant. It's like the pastors, and I know a lot of them are being taught wrong. Well, you've got a doctorate yourself, so you know how they're taught in Bible colleges and that kind of thing. So, but some of this stuff just doesn't seem like it's even possible to make a mistake on. And when I get on mine, I'll kind of get to that. You were talking about Christian Israel and how we would prove it up. We all know the point, the cross reference to Deuteronomy 18:15, which is about Christ. That's used in the New Testament multiple times. In fact, I've made a chart, and I'll pull up my little chart on the quotes, and then that'll be helpful. But the thing is, before Deuteronomy 18:15, that was basically a quote about Moses when he's asking, well, what do I tell these Israel people? In other words, what do I tell them? What do I call you? What do you know? And he said, I am. Call me I am. Refer to me as I am, or I am that I am, and that kind of thing. And so people refer back to that as being Christ. So of course that was at Mount Sinai. But before they got to Mount Sinai, is there anything that you would connect Christ back to in Scripture? I mean, what would you point back to before 18:15 of Deuteronomy?
Well, in their travels, as they traveled there, of course, they had the rock that was split for the water. That was a picture of Christ, at least. And Jesus and Abraham, when he offered his son, Jesus explained to him that he would be the sacrifice. And he believed that if he offered his son, that Christ could raise him from the dead. All of those things refer back to him. You have more of that probably than I have as far as knowledge about exact scriptures talking about Christ. I think you've done a marvelous work in that area.
Well, you just brought up the important thing, though, was about Abraham. And I was going to say, why did Abraham, that is the most important thing, why did Abraham reason that, even if you want to say it was just God or whatever you want to say, why did Abraham reason that God would raise Isaac from the dead? Why did he think that? What did he know at that point that we could see in Scripture that would have told us that, of course, he would believe that thing? And that's in Hebrews. I think that's Hebrews chapter 11 that you're referring to.
Yeah. Well, I don't know exactly what scripture you're referring to, but of course, I think he met the priest. I can't think of his name now.
Melchizedek? You're talking about Melchizedek?
Yeah, Melchizedek.
Right. Chapter 14. Right.
And I think that was Christ, and I think Abraham understood that. Okay.
But is there anything else that would have given Abraham that you can think of? Because I can think of something. There's one thing there that I think pastors have missed completely that I just don't get. It's right there. I think it's chapter 17 of Genesis. It says in my Bible twice that Abraham and Sarah were made young again, or returned to a period of youth. Every Bible states it slightly different, but at the time they had Isaac, Sarah was 90 years old and Abraham was 100. Okay, well, people, they'd already stated, well, she was long past, childbearing age and all that kind of thing. And she knew that, and Abraham knew it, but still they had this faith that something was going to happen. So that's why she got Hagar to have a child with Abraham. And I think that was really about the idea that, well, was it her or was it him? Maybe it's not me. Maybe Sarah's thinking, well, the problem's not me, it's him. You know, in other words, he's the one. He's the problem. It's not my fault. It's his fault. I'm doing my part. You know.
Yeah.
So I'll take Hagar, and then that'll prove if he's not able to have a child with Hagar, then that'll prove that it's him that is the reason we're not having this son between us. You see, I think that's kind of what she was thinking. However, after that whole blow up there with the child, Ishmael and all that, it says that they were made young again. Okay. Now, I got a reason to believe that they were actually made 65 years younger again, which would have made her 25 and him 35. And the reason is when you read on through Genesis, you notice that later on, everybody realizes that it says they consider Abraham to be a god. And the reason, of course, is they've seen all these blessings that he's been blessed with, but I think that all kind of revolves around him having a child, because he was 100 years old and he had a child, and Sarah was 90 and had a child. But I think they had to have actually been made physically young again. And here's my whole reason. Because if you go on past there, I think it's chapter 20, you notice right before they have Isaac, they go and meet the king Abimelech. So they're at this king Abimelech, and of course he has this vision, is told not to touch Sarah and all that kind of thing. But the point is why would this king Abimelech want to have Sarah as a wife or a concubine or any of that kind of thing if she was 90 years old? I don't care what she looks like. If she was 90 years old, why would he? There's no way he would want her as a wife. That's impossible. There's no logic. Zero logic that Abimelech would want Sarah, right?
That's a good point.
Yeah.
I never had thought about that. Never have heard that.
But since it says they were made young again, and then it says that Abimelech.
Where does it say that? I don't know.
That's chapter 17, 14, I think, is one of those. It says it twice there within a few verses. It says they were made, mine says return to a period of youth. Some said young again. Each Bible states it slightly different. But right there in chapter 17, twice, there's a double witness that says they were made young again. And then right after that is where we see that this young king Abimelech wants to have Sarah as a wife or a concubine, either way, and she's 90 years old. Well, no, there's no logic that anybody can come up with that would say, yeah, this king, 30 years old king or however old he is, would want a 90-year-old wife. He'd be the laughing stock of his kingdom if he was. You see, it's impossible. It's impossible. So I think that exactly what it says is what will happen. And then that resolves the problem of how Abraham reasoned that God would raise his son from the dead, because he'd already been given an example, and the example was that he was 100 and now he's 35.
Well, I don't have an argument against that. Obviously.
So from Abraham's idea, what I'm saying is, from Abraham's reasoning, now he can reason, well, if God can make me young again, and now I'm 35, or regardless of what he's thinking, but he's young again, he's having a son. If he can give me a son at 100 and make me young, then he can raise Isaac from the dead. That's logical. Yeah, that's perfect logic. So there's no faulty logic in that. And I think that if you just read it the way it says and believe it the way it says, then that makes perfect sense.
Yes. Well, it's a good point. Very good point. And I think there's so much truth that when I came to understand this message, it just opened the Bible up in a way that I'd already gone through seminary, and I had 2 doctorate degrees and a master's degree, and I was not taught this message, and the Bible had a lot of things that I couldn't understand. There still are some things that we'll never understand, I suppose, but this message makes the Bible alive. It makes it real, makes it apply to our lives, gives us hope, gives us a reason to live, and gives us a reason to be happy even in tough days when things are not right. because God is in charge. God is going to see his people through. He's not going to leave us in the lurch. And it's not going to be by the rapture either. It's going to be by making us into a kingdom of people who are going to rule with him. That's the way it's going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. But the most important thing about what you just said is that these chosen people you're talking about are Christian, they're Israelites,
right?
Because it's a fulfillment of prophecy, like you said, is really from the Abrahamic covenant. Even though it starts at Adam, it's really from the Abrahamic covenant because that's what connects all the way up to the New Testament, and all that's quoted. And I've gone through that extensively. But the point is now it's actually all those prophecies you read. There's prophecies in Genesis we should talk about, but from Genesis forward, all these prophecies from the Abrahamic covenant forward are fulfilled as stated if there was a group of Israel people who believed in Yahweh. And I use the term Yahweh because Dr. Miles Jones, which is a PhD in language, he was the one that found that written on rocks in the area of Mount Sinai, which is in Saudi Arabia, which most people should know that by now. It's been on TV. And they're building a city there, and they've actually built some things real close to Mount Sinai. They're already doing things there. It's amazing. But at any rate, so he found some rocks that had inscriptions. He found the first menorah that was inscribed into a rock. I don't know if you've seen all that video, but at any rate, it was done by Jim and Penny Caldwell. It was published back in the early 2000s. And but basically, they got their idea of where to go to from Ron Wyatt. So really, the credit starts back at Ron Wyatt back in 1984, and the churches had this idea that Mount Sinai was over there. And the real thing is why is that significant today? And that's what I'm working on. I'm working on a whole. So if you want to switch over and talk a little bit about what I'm looking about and how that fits back to Christian Israel, I've got some documents pulled up. And by the way, there's my channel, Rev9 video, and some of the stuff we want to talk about is Gentiles or Israelites. I've just finished up a three video series with Eli James explaining why Gentiles, the word Gentiles has to connect to Israel in almost all cases. And I've done a more extensive version of that on my channel as well. And then we have a video of you and some others over here with Paul that are in my playlist. And that's what people need to look at besides my videos. They need to go over to my playlist. But I'm working on this document called The Significance of the Real Mount Sinai to Christian Israelites. And by the real Mount Sinai, I mean the one in Saudi Arabia. And I can prove up, I think beyond a doubt, that the Israel people, Moses specifically, when they came out of in the Exodus, they went across what we call the Gulf of Aqaba, which was just called the Red Sea back then. And all that's been found. It's all in video. And we, like I said, we give credit to Ron Wyatt. But beyond Ron Wyatt, there's at least 10 other people that deserve credit for finding different things that prove up this message. And there's some current video being made. There's people there right now shooting new video, which is going to elaborate on that. The good thing about the newest video is it's all in high def. Some of it's in like 4K drone footage. There's some real high quality stuff coming out. Once you go to the real Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia, then you can realize that, oh, this is it. Because all of these things, I mean, you start in the book of Exodus and read the book of Exodus again, and you're going to realize that every little thing mentioned in Exodus that would be at Mount Sinai is at the real Mount Sinai in Saudi Arabia. There's just so many, this is a long list. There's all these little things. It would take us a couple of hours to go through each one and then go over there and show you where it is. But the important thing about this, the other part of this is I came into some conclusions when I was studying this stuff. I started, of course, back at Genesis. Well, I really kind of went from Exodus, and then I backed up into Genesis to see if there was anything in Genesis, because I'm looking at all the cross references. So when I get up to, let me scroll down, I'll show you what I mean. When I get up into my chart here, it starts at Exodus, okay? And then I go in here and I put cross references, for example, see? So right there at the very beginning in Exodus, you have some of these cross references, and actually this Acts 7:30, this is actually about Christ. The angel of the Lord in the burning bush, that was actually a cedar bush. It's still there.
Yeah.
And that was called, a lot of people use the term Yahweh, but it's actually Dr. Jones, which I didn't get to. He said the proper way to pronounce that would be Yahweh, and it's the same word that we get Jehovah from. It should be pronounced Yahweh, and it just means I am. But this I am is actually mentioned back here in Exodus before, actually I got it right here, Jehovah Almighty God, pronounced Yahweh, per Dr. Miles Jones. Okay, so I've got these, I look up all these cross references, and then what that did is it brought me back to some realizations that back here in Genesis, this El Paran, which is by the wilderness, and you remember this is where Hagar went to. When you start looking up this land of Paran, wilderness of Paran, where Mount Paran is, it's in Arabia. Okay, and if you just follow up everything about Paran, you'll find that the area is right around Mount Sinai. Okay, and I concluded my notes below that Mount Paran is actually Mount Sinai. It's the same mountain because it's called the mountain of God. There's only one mountain of God. It's either Mount Sinai or it's Mount Paran.
Yeah.
Right. And since Paran is just a little area right next to Sinai, then obviously it's the same thing.
Right. Good.
Yeah. And as you're going through here, I've got a number of other pieces of logic, which I'm going to teach in my next video. But then I went down, I talked about Hagar. And if you remember this Jehovah Jireh, which is the way people state it, which means the revealing Yahweh will be seen in the mountain of Yahweh. Again, that's Genesis 22:14, you see. Well, there's that Jehovah, which is Christ. Yeah. That actually comes from Deuteronomy 18:15. So see, Christ keeps going backwards and backwards and backwards all through the New Testament. However, you had us back at the right spot. Let me just scroll down because I get to it when I get to it right here. This Christ the shield. This is really where it starts. This Christ the shield is in Genesis 15:1. And he says, I am your shield and your exceeding great reward. Well, that was Melchizedek speaking, but Christ the shield, which is who's speaking there, that's Christ the rock from 1 Corinthians 10:4. Everybody knows the concept of Christ the rock, but they have never been told Christ the shield. That is actually, should be the cross reference to the first verse of the New Testament. Christ the son of David, Christ the son of Abraham. Where's Christ the son of Abraham? That's it. It's Christ the shield, which is Christ the rock, which is Christ the scepter of Judah in Genesis 49:10. So right there in Genesis, you have Christ mentioned multiple times, and that's what I'm going to get into in my next video on this. But it also comes from Acts 3:20 and 7:36 through 38 in Acts, and Christ himself uses that in John 1:21 and 29. John 5:46. So I am your shield and exceeding great rewards. Christ promising himself as a redeemer for Abraham's posterity. Now, that is what Paul's telling people over in Galatians 3:16. Right. And if you have a cross-reference Bible and look that up, the first verse of the New Testament up, you'll see it goes to Galatians 3:16, but it doesn't go back to where it should go back to, which is, Genesis 15:1. And when you go over there, you have Paul explaining that, Christ was promised first. Then the law came 430 years later. So you have a lot of people look at that and say, well, no, that couldn't be because it doesn't fit, you see. But yes, Paul was correct. Christ was promised. Christ was the whole thing that all these people were waiting on to come. The only problem people really had was they didn't understand all of these prophecies of the old. Of course, there was no New Testament. But they didn't understand the prophecies. All those prophecies they were looking at, they thought were only going to come about one time. In other words, they thought Christ was going to come one time and then do everything that was in all of those prophecies in Jeremiah and Isaiah and all of it. You see,
Yeah.
they had no concept that Christ was going to come, die on the cross, be buried, raised again, and then leave for some period of time, which I would say was a couple thousand years. And I think we can show that. But the point is, they had no concept. So I think that's their whole problem. When Christ came the first time, Christ was telling them all these prophecies. He was teaching these prophecies. However, the prophecies, a lot of these prophecies he was teaching was about when he was going to return. And that's what I was talking about in Luke 24:44. And if you go through Acts, you can see that, your apostles were teaching about Christ coming. In other words, they were teaching about the first coming of Christ. And then all of a sudden they switched to when he's going to return, which is the second coming. Right. So you can clearly see that distinction in Acts and Romans and other places where they're teaching in the New Testament that they're teaching all this stuff. And of course, they got that from Christ, as it says in Luke 24:44, that he taught them everything about himself from Moses, the prophets, and Psalms. Right. So Christ was teaching them about him in the books of Moses, which is why I was asking you about where this starts in the book of Moses. Then, in the book of Moses, we know, Deuteronomy 18:15, but actually Christ starts right there, as you were pointing out, at Melchizedek, which really starts at the covenant in chapter 12. The verses 1 through 3 is those quotes to Acts, and that was Stephen that taught that.
Right. Yeah. Well, and the covenants were made strictly with his people, and they weren't made for everybody. So that's why the mission work is so gruesome in these days. Is we're violating God's Christ's own words when he said, right. Toss not the pearls before the swine. And I don't mean to be derogatory toward any other people, but the pearls are the covenants. And when we go offer these covenants to people who they're not for, we're creating a problem that we can't fix, and it's going to cause a lot of problems. It has caused a lot of problems already.
Yeah, well, that is a big thing. So this whole teaching that you're doing right now with the Saxon University, and by the way, you probably didn't clarify that, but you're going to be offering like a degree, different types of degrees of that thing. Well, you should probably mention that. And
we'll offer a degree for teachers, not for public schools, but for teachers of the Bible, and we'll offer pastoral degrees, and we'll offer maybe some other degrees also. We're looking into the possibility of degrees for counseling, or for degrees for theology teaching at a college level. These are possibilities. So we are looking at 2 or 3 or 4 different degrees right now, and we will offer some advanced degrees, and we will give advanced degrees to those that have earned them.
All right. Well, here's one other thing then you might want to mention, and we'll go back to your channel. People can look at the videos we're putting up there, and we've got videos up there that are labeled home, which like this one, and Arkansas. So do you want to talk a little bit about local people in Branson and that kind of thing?
Yes. We're very privileged. We have here in Houston, Missouri, and our mission center where we live, as well as run the mission ministry office out of. Once a month, on the 3rd Sunday of each month, we meet here at noon, have lunch, and then I teach the Bible. And we have fellowship. We have question and answers. We do whatever we can. And with Dr. Dave's being here, he's able to answer a lot of questions. And there are other people that are qualified also. And we meet once a month in Mountain Home, Arkansas, on the 1st Sunday of the month. We meet there at 1 o'clock in the afternoon to 3 o'clock. We don't always stay till 3, but we're there. We got the room for a couple of hours. We're at the Holiday Inn Express from 1 3 o'clock in Mountain Home on the first Sunday of every month. So you're welcome to come to those Bible studies. Now, we have people in Branson. We have several people in Branson who come to both of these studies, or they come primarily to one or the other. But we have people from Mountain View and Harrison and all of the area around that Mountain Home, Arkansas, where people come. And we're ministering to about, I believe the last count I had, we had about 35 or 40 families that we minister to through these different Bible studies that we have and fellowships. And we go into Wisconsin at least once or twice a year. We're scheduling there for the latter part of October this year. And we plan to try to hit some other places. We went to Kansas a couple of times last year, and we went to Mississippi and Alabama a couple of times since in the last 4 or 5 years. So we get around wherever God's people are and where they want to hear the word. We try to get there. And if you want to come to one of these Bible studies, go to my website, send me a message. Every page on my website has a place where you can fill in a question. Doesn't cost you anything. You can send me an email through that, or you can send me a message. There it is. Contact us and give me a question or whatever, and I'll do my best to get back to you. And if you want one of them,
Everett Ramsey DD.com. You should you don't have it written up here.
Okay, yeah. My personal website is everettramseydd.com, and I didn't put DD in there to exploit my title, but somebody else already had everettramsey.com, so I had to do something. Could have put 1, 2, I guess. But go to that website, send me a message. I get messages from new people all the time. And if you want one of my books, let me know about it. I give my books away to people to support the ministry. And if you don't have any money, I'll give it to you anyway. So I'm interested in getting the word out. But anything there that you want, if you can't put it in the cart and make a donation through PayPal, just tell me what you want and give me your address and I'll send it to you.
Well, and come on, a suggested donation of $5 for the Kingdom Commentary on Romans, which is 400 pages. Yeah, that's pretty cheap. So, but I've got to really bring one problem up with this is that you don't have your newest book, which I've got a nice picture of it here. God Made a Racial Choice, right? And that's on Amazon, by the way. And there's the ISBN number. So I've got that on mine because that's such a good book. And if you go over to Amazon, you'll see it right here. God Made a Racial Choice, a study on the exclusivity of God's covenant with his people, and his people are the Christian Israel. He didn't choose people to disbelieve in him. And see, that's my whole problem with people who teach the Bible. Starting right there at Mount Sinai, you had all these people that disbelieved on him, which is the whole reason they went 40 years through the desert, is because 10 times they had to be judged, and finally sent them off through Saudi Arabia. And there is some other things about that I'm going to talk about in my video, but this is a new book, just came out. People really need to get that one. It's $18.99 in paperback on their on Amazon.